Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the 10th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies lecture series. The theme of the series is Buddhism and the Senses. We are very happy and honored to have invited Professor Donald Lopez of the University of Michigan, together with 4 distinguished scholars, to deliver this lecture series. Today, Professor Robert DeCaroli, Professor of South and Southeast Asian Art History of the George Mason University, will deliver the second lecture of the series. He will talk about the sense of sight. Before the lecture begins, I would like to invite Professor Donald Lopez, the 10th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies of the University of Hong Kong, and the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies of the University of Michigan, to welcome and introduce our today's speaker. Professor Lopez, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce the second of 7 lectures on the topic of Buddhism and the Senses, a lecture series hosted by the Center of Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong with the generous support of the Mama Charitable Foundation. Let me say something about how this lecture series came about. In 2017, the National Museum of Asian Art of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. opened a major exhibition of Buddhist art consisting entirely of pieces from its own Freer and Sackler galleries. Generously supported by the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, the exhibition was called Encountering the Buddha. Like many major exhibitions of art, it was decided that the show should produce a scholarly volume. These have traditionally been beautifully illustrated art books. However, with so much of the greatest Buddhist art, including the entire collection of the National Museum of Asian Art now available to us with just a few clicks on our laptop, it was decided to do something different. The arts are things that we experience through our senses: the sense of sight for the visual arts, the sense of hearing for the musical arts, the senses of smell and taste for the culinary arts, and the sense of touch for the erotic arts. Buddhism is renowned for its disparagement and suspicion of sense experience, or its sense skepticism, as a philosopher would say. And yet, Buddhism has made major contributions to each of these arts: the visual, the musical, the culinary, and the erotic. Why not explore this dilemma? In July 2021, a group of 10 scholars of Buddhism met via Zoom with the National Museum of Asian Art staff for a 2-day workshop with 2 scholars presenting on each of the 5 senses. The essays that resulted from that workshop will be published by Wisdom Publications next year in a book called, as you might expect, Buddhism and the Senses. The second lecture in this University of Hong Kong series on the sense of sight will be given by Professor Robert DeCaroli, a scholar of Indian Buddhist art at George Mason University in Virginia. The third lecture on the sense of hearing will be given by me. The fourth lecture on the sense of smell will be given by Professor Lena Verchery of Victoria University in New Zealand, a scholar of Chinese Buddhism. The fifth lecture on the sense of taste will be given by Professor James Robson of Harvard, a scholar of Chinese and Japanese Buddhism. The 6th lecture on the sense of touch will be given by Professor Reiko Onuma of Dartmouth College, a scholar of Indian Buddhism. And the series will conclude with a final lecture by me. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Robert DeCaroli of the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University. He received his doctorate from UCLA, where he studied with 2 of America's leading scholars of Indian Buddhism, Robert Brown and Gregory Chopin. He's the author of 2 important books. The first, called Haunting the Buddha, deals with all of the demigods that populate Buddhist texts and works of art, the Nagas and Gandharvas and Yakshas, demonstrating their importance in the Buddhist imaginaire. The second book is called Image Problems: The Origin and Development of the Buddha Image in Early South Asia. Here he explores in fascinating detail a host of questions that surround the physical representation of the Buddha in the early centuries of the Dharma. And he and I are the editors of the forthcoming volume on Buddhism and the Senses, from which these lectures are drawn. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Robert DeCaroli, who will discuss the sense of sight.
Thank you so much, Don, and thank you for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to speak to you today as part of this 10th Mama Charitable Foundation lecture series at Hong Kong University's Center for Buddhist Studies. My thanks to Amy Yu and Ben Yu and Don Lopez and all the other organizers for inviting me to participate in this series today. Now, I've been asked to talk about the topic of sight. So to do that, I'm going to put up a PowerPoint because we might as well look at something interesting. One moment. There we go. Of all the senses, vision is the most prominently addressed in the early sources, as well as in modern scholarship. Unlike most of the other senses, vision has not been marginalized or overlooked by academics. Rather, it's been an exceptionally prominent part of Buddhist studies for years. The entire subfield of Buddhist art history has been dedicated to analyzing the visual material in stone and wood, metal, cloth, and paint created by Buddhists over the centuries. Art history has been engaged with aspects of sight and produced scholarship dedicated to searching for historically informed ways to interpret the visual culture of Buddhism. In other words, reconstructing the ways Buddhists in particular times and in particular places viewed their world. Reconstructing the ways, which often differed from what we might expect. For example, Robert Brown questioned the tendency to approach Buddhist sculpture and painting with the same expectations applied to contemporary forms of artwork. He noted that in many cases, these sculptures and paintings were placed in places that were entirely hidden or inaccessible to the public, and they were never intended to be seen. Here I'm showing you the hidden foot at Borobudur in Indonesia. You'll notice that the original foundation would have covered the sculptures that you're seeing in the lower level there. This was probably due to an architectural need as the building began to spread shortly after it was built. But the same can't be said for the relic chambers inside Wat Rat Purana in Ayutthaya, Thailand. These beautifully painted interior spaces were sealed. And in fact, the only reason we know about them is that in 1950, tomb robbers attempted to steal the relics that were encased inside this closed chamber. Now, when Robert Brown looked at these examples, he concluded that the religious function and placement of the art was often far more important than any hypothetical viewer or audience. More recently, Vijay Deheja and Peter Rockwell applied similar scrutiny to the concepts of completion in Buddhist art, specifically as it pertains to South Asian rock-cut architecture. They noted that historically grounded notions of what made a structure finished differ significantly from what most modern expectations would be. And here I'm showing you just one of their examples. This is the caves in Kanheri, Cave 3, just outside of Mumbai in India. And if you look at it, you'll notice that the pillars in the back are remarkably different than the pillars in the front. There's other details in here as well, suggesting that what might look finished to us or complete to us wasn't always that important to people in antiquity, or at least they had different ways of measuring those things. A more widespread body of scholarship engages with shifting notions of visual beauty. Nathan McGovern, for example, has explored the reasoning behind the Buddha's very unusual physical appearance as defined by his bodily marks, or lakshana. He connects these literary descriptions with forms of prognostication and fortune-telling that, when taken out of context, describe the Buddha as having a remarkably unusual appearance. In fact, most of the visual traditions of the Buddha's body don't follow the literary descriptions. One of the few places where it can be argued that the artists were inspired more by the textual descriptions than by the visual tradition would be in 14th century Thailand in the Sukhothai style Buddha, which is so remarkably different and sort of attenuated, elongated, and elegant, but in a way that's markedly different from other Buddha images. Now, John Powers has taken similar approaches, considering how images of the Buddha conform with or differ from South Asian notions of idealized masculinity. And these works all recognize that notions of visual beauty vary significantly with time and with place. Working particularly on material from China, Chunfang Yu has traced how the male Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara transformed into the female Guanyin in East Asia. In the process, she reveals how cultural expectations about gender roles and expectations about women's appearances and behavior help to drive this transition. Ideas about visual beauty are among the most malleable cultural expressions And these examples are just a small sample of the significant work that's been done on the topic. When grouped together under the broad category of Buddhist visuality, this type of scholarship provides a context for the lived realities of Buddhist practitioners and helps to keep contemporary readers cognizant of how the interpretations of visual material have changed and the ways our own expectations might accidentally lead us to misunderstandings. These are just a few of the recent examples in a long history of scholarship on the visual arts and Buddhism. I mention these few diverse examples to help exemplify how the subject of sight or vision in Buddhism is a truly massive topic. It's far too much material to cover in a single talk. So today, I'd like to accomplish two things. First, I'd like to give an overview of vision's role in Buddhism generally, and then I'd like to ground these ideas in a small example, narrow the topic dramatically by focusing on just one moment in South Asian Buddhist history. We'll look closely at a single time and a single place, specifically 4th century North India. This was a moment when the ways that sight and vision were understood within the culture began to change, and this led not only to new ideas about the aspects of human sight and approaches to religious ritual, but it also changed the way the Buddha's eyes were actually depicted, both in sculpted and painted representations. Just as concepts of beauty can change, so can ideas about vision and representation. But before tackling the specific, let's first look at the general. In discussing vision, it's important to acknowledge that the problematic concept of desire, which is so incredibly central to Buddhist understanding of the world, is intimately associated with vision in Buddhist sources. This is made exceptionally clear in the narrative tradition. A wide range of stories emphasize the power vision has to impact behavior and therefore karma. However, this is an ambivalent and risky power that has the capacity for both advancing Dharma and for accomplishing the exact opposite. Often, the sources equivocate over what constitutes good or bad forms of seeing. Stories get retold at times, and new authors do not always draw the same conclusions as their predecessors, disagreeing over the dangers or benefits derived from seeing. Now, in order to clarify this more effectively, I'd like to begin with some stories. Specifically, let's start with the widely told story of the courtesan Sri Ma. Her tale in many ways exemplifies what we might expect from Buddhist views regarding desire, as well as regarding attachment, in that it subverts societal standards by pointing out the dangers of the beautiful and the value of non-attachment that can be cultivated through unpleasant sights. Sri Ma was the most renowned courtesan in the city of Rajagriha, famous for her beauty and her wealth that she had earned from it. After a chance encounter with the Buddha, she gained insight and became an avid supporter of the monastic order. The author, Ashvaghosha, writes that she fed the monks every day and soon became well known among them for both her beauty and her generosity. Rather predictably, some of the monks became infatuated with her and struggled with their commitment to their vows, as well as with upholding the Dharma. At this time, Sri Ma became ill, but despite her suffering, she continued to give right up until the moment of her untimely death. Recognizing an opportunity, the Buddha made a very unusual request. He commanded that her corpse be displayed for all to see. He then asked who would pay to spend the night with her, and when no one responded, as time went on, the Buddha lowered the price until it was free, and still no one accepted. In this way, the monks were purged of their lust and came to recognize the impermanence of all physical things. The Buddha's actions in the story paved the way for a widespread practice known as corpse meditation, which requires looking upon the decomposition of a corpse over the course of several days. I'll show you just two examples here. This is a Thai example from the 1900s, taking place in a cremation ground where you can see the decomposing corpse on the ground. Probably one of the most famous representations of this comes from Japan, however. This is the body of a courtesan in 9 stages. It is a series of paintings. I'm only showing you 3 here, but there's 9 in the original that go from the moment of the woman on her deathbed all the way up until the final image where it's just a cluster of bones in the dust. And so these meditations were thought to be particularly effective in helping monks uphold their vow of chastity. Before moving on to another tale, you may be interested to know, however, that Sri Ma attended the viewing of her own corpse because after her death, she was reborn as a goddess, still devoted to the Buddha, and therefore appeared at the moment when her corpse was displayed to the monks. So I think it's safe to say that vision and sight in this story are treated as we might expect them to be in Buddhist contexts. Beauty leads to desire, which causes some monks to stray from the Dharma. Conversely, the horrific sight of the decomposing body reminds the monks of the inevitability of death and worldly suffering, thereby restoring them to the path. This is obviously an inversion of normal expectations about what constitutes good and bad sights. However, it conforms to Buddhist views on the nature of the world and on the treachery of our senses. A slight variation on the treatment of both vision and desire, and the desire it engenders, is encountered in the story of the Buddha's half-brother, Nanda. In this tale, Ashvaghosha wrote that on the day of Nanda's coronation and marriage, he was intercepted by the Buddha, who asks Nanda to join him in the monastery, and then pressures him to become a monk. Nanda reluctantly agrees, but in the following days, he struggles with the thoughts of his beautiful betrothed and the life that he had left behind. In order to help him with this, the Buddha brings Nanda on a trip by way of the Himalayan mountains up to the Tavatimsa heaven. Upon seeing the otherworldly beauty of the celestial maidens, Nanda forgets his betrothed and becomes fully intent on someday becoming reborn in heaven among the beautiful maidens who live there. When the Buddha assures him that as a monk, he can earn a rebirth in heaven, Nanda redoubles his monastic efforts. Now, it is intriguing that the text, as in the Sri Ma story, then invokes the image of a corpse by contrast, stating that these heavenly maidens surpassed his human betrothed in beauty as a human woman would surpass the corpse of a female monkey. Eventually, Nanda attains the status of an arhat and comes to recognize the shallowness and misguided nature of his original motivations. And having overcome his desires so completely, the Buddha names Nanda the monk who is foremost in self-control. In the image, you might see the large figures on the right. The largest one is the Buddha. He's holding the hand of Nanda, who he's leading into heaven. And in that upper terrace, you can see the heavenly maidens sitting, reclining, dancing. The vision that inspired Nanda to redouble his efforts towards becoming a good monk in hopes of being someday reborn among them. So the story is notable for its twist in the way that it subverts our expectations. Here, Nanda does the right thing for the wrong reasons. It is the desire enkindled by his sight of celestial maidens that drives him to follow his vows. This seems to be a clear example of upaya, skill at means, or expedient means, in which the Buddha advocates the use of any approach, even potentially misleading or fraudulent ones, to lead someone away from worldly attachment and towards insight. It's important to recognize, however, that while the initial motivation might have been driven by desire, the desire is eventually rejected as Nanda gains true wisdom. Therefore, the stories of Sri Ma and Nanda ultimately wind up making very similar points about the desires that rise from vision. In one instance, disgusting sights reveal the illusion of beauty and validate the Buddhist teachings on the nature of impermanence. In the other, beauty is used as a lure to essentially trick a monk into gaining further wisdom and insight into the Dharma. Ultimately, both reveal visual attraction as a hurdle to be overcome by those seeking wisdom. Now, I should add that this approach to sight is true not just regarding attractive people, but Buddhist texts and art also portray the visual beauties of various pure lands and heavens, where wish-granting trees made of gold and jewels and other marvels all exist. And the desire to enter these realms inspires good actions, much as they did for Nanda. Likewise, the texts and artwork also explicate the horrific torments suffered by ghosts and those in hells, which discourage inappropriate deeds, much as they did for the monks infatuated with Sri Ma. Vision has the potential to inspire and drive action, which is the literal root of karma. However, not every tale is so clear. In some cases, the situations are very ambiguous or open to interpretation, and not every Buddhist author told them or understood them in exactly the same manner. For example, according to the Dhammapada commentary, when a young Brahmin named Vakali first encountered the Buddha, he immediately became transfixed by the Buddha's beauty. This was no passing fancy, and Vakali resolved that on the spot to become a monk so that he might continue to live near the teacher's presence. Yet even after taking his vows, Vakali neglected his duties and skipped his training so that he might remain in the Buddha's presence. Eventually, the Buddha responded to this infatuation and advised Vakali not to focus on the corrupt physical body, but rather to perceive the Dharma, the true form of the teacher. What follows is exceedingly unusual in Buddhist literature, because it appears that Vakali completely ignores the Buddha's admonition. In an understated way, the text tells us that Vakali cannot bring himself to leave the Buddha's presence. Finally, the Buddha acts in a more decisive manner by insisting that Vakali spend the 3 months of the rain retreat at a different monastery. This news is almost too much for Vakali to bear, and in his distraught state, he contemplates ending his own life. As he prepares to jump from a precipice overlooking the monastery, the Buddha compassionately sends him a vision to dissuade him from his rash course of action. Specifically, the Buddha projects a radiant image of himself, which immediately banishes Vakali's sadness. The text assures us that full of joy and satisfaction, the monk who has perfect faith in the religion of the Buddha reached the place of peace, cessation, existence, and happiness. In other words, this miracle not only brings Vakali to his senses, it also propels him into an advanced spiritual state of arhatship. The Buddha then beckons Vakali by calling, "Come, Vakali, fear not, as you look upon the Buddha. I will lift you up even as one extricates an elephant that is sunk into the mire. Come, Vakali, fear not, as you look upon the Tathagata, the Buddha. I will release you even as one releases the sun from the maw of an eclipse." Now, in response to this, Vakali realizes his own supernatural powers and flies to the Buddha's side. This literal leap of faith earns Vakali the honor of being recognized as the monk who is foremost among those with implicit faith. The designation earned by Vakali appears to have been well known in the Pali tradition and appears in several texts, including the Anguttara Nikaya. In many ways, this is an unusual tale. In particular, the fact that Vakali ignores the Buddha's advice and still manages to succeed in attaining profound spiritual insight is not at all indicative of the way these stories usually play out. Jacob Kinnard has perceptively discussed the way the story promotes the value in seeing the Buddha and advocates for the act of gazing upon the Buddha's likeness as a means to attain spiritually advanced states. This sort of emotionally charged viewing appears to be very similar to the sorts of actions associated with Hindu devotional forms of worship, such as bhakti, which I will be discussing in more detail later. The story and its commentary never goes so far as to make a direct connection to statues of the Buddha, but I think the implication is certainly there. Leaving aside broader interpretations, on a basic level, this early Dhammapada commentary version of Vakali's story demonstrates that the sight of the Buddha, even one based on attraction to the Buddha's form, is ultimately beneficial. Another abbreviated version of this tale appears in the Divyavadana and relates a rather different sequence of events. In it, Vakali, here named Vakalin, is a Brahmin seer who, upon encountering the Buddha for the first time, is immediately imbued with deep faith. Then, fearful that the Buddha might look past him when selecting disciples, he resolves to throw himself from a cliff. At this point, the Buddha, who was aware of Vakali's reasoning, uses his powers to bring the desperate man safely to his side. There, he teaches the Dharma to Vakali, who subsequently attains insight and becomes a monk. The differences between the two versions of the story are quite notable, but perhaps the most apparent discrepancy are the lack of Vakali's ongoing visual fixation with the presence of the Buddha, and the Buddha's admonition against devotion to physical forms. In the version of the tale found in the Divyavadana, Vakali's shockingly extreme response is motivated by the deep faith generated when Vakali first looks upon the Buddha. His subsequent life-threatening actions win him the counsel of the teacher and consequently result in his acquisition of spiritual insight. So although his fascination with the Buddha's physical form is arguably not the direct cause of his spiritual progress, it certainly sets him on the right path by helping him gain access to the teachings. Further tales of Vakali appear in the Samyutta Nikaya, in which the normally active and single-minded monk appears bedridden. In this account, the dying Vakali sends for the Buddha, who travels to the monk's bedside. Once there, the Buddha instructs Vakali not to put faith in corporeal forms, stating rather, "One who sees the Dharma sees me." To drive this point home, Vakali repeatedly states, "I have no more desire, lust, or affection. Feeling is impermanent. Perception is impermanent." After the Buddha departs, a night passes during which two devatas, or gods, appear to the Buddha and foretell Vakali's spiritual success. The Buddha sends words of this to Vakali, and soon after, the Buddha and his monks are informed that Vakali has died during the night. This very sad tale has a curiously positive epilogue in which the Buddha explains that Vakali's death was not a bad one because he had already passed on and achieved liberation. Scholars have noted, however, that the words spoken to Vakali by the Buddha are quite ambiguous. Specifically, while the Buddha is providing instruction at the monk's sickbed, he seems to be saying that seeing the Buddha's body is the equivalent to seeing the Dharma, thereby putting his physical appearance on the same level as his teachings. Yet by emphasizing the Dharmic lesson of impermanence, rather than Vakali's sight of the Buddha as the cause of his eventual liberation, the text ultimately argues against this equivalency. Therefore, I think it would be a mistake to overemphasize the hints of sympathy for image use or figural devotion in the Samyutta Nikaya, because it would require overlooking the very prominent passages that speak of Vakali's deep realization of the temporary nature of physical forms. And while devotion derived from vision is by no means antithetical to the realization of impermanence, this story sets devotion to the Buddha's visible form as the imperfect alternative to the liberating realizations achieved via the invisible Dharma. In this sense, the insights gained through Vakali's visual fixation on the Buddha's form, as presented in the Dhammapada commentary and the Divyavadana, are effectively challenged and contradicted by the Samyutta Nikaya version of events, in which ultimate liberation requires abandoning visual devotion to the Buddha's form in favor of the unsayable Dharma. While it's true that each story featuring Vakali, the monk who is foremost in the quality of faith, there is some statement, albeit perfunctorily at times, claiming that the Buddha is properly embodied only in his teachings. The stories also reveal a certain amount of power associated with the Buddha's visual form. In two versions, Vakali attains heightened spiritual states either directly or tangentially through his commitment to the Buddha's physical appearance, a claim that undoubtedly connected to the use of artwork depicting the Buddha that was gaining increased popularity during the 1st century CE. Perhaps more than anything, however, these stories identify a powerful and keenly felt longing to see the Buddha, and Vakali was not alone in that predilection. Take, for example, the nun Utpalavarna, or Utpalavana in the Pali, who is famous for her efforts to greet the Buddha as he returned to earth after preaching in heaven. To clarify, the Buddha had left the world for a while in order to preach to his mother in the Tristrimsa heaven because she had died before hearing the Dharma. This tale is preserved in many sources, but one of the most detailed accounts can be found in the writings of the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who traveled to China in the early 400s. Faxian states that during the 3 months in which the Buddha preached in heaven, he was sorely missed by those left behind. As his time away drew to a close, the Buddha sent word to his followers that he would be returning to the city of Samkasya in 7 days. Consequently, an enormous crowd gathered at the spot. Kings, ministers, ordinary people, not having seen the Buddha for a long time, were all looking up, as the text describes, thirstily for him. In the midst of this imposing throng of people was the nun Utpalavarna. And as she waited, she pondered a very specific problem. She desperately wished to be the first to greet the Buddha upon his return. But as a woman in such an august gathering of kings and monks, she would never be permitted that honor. Therefore, she used her spiritual power to take on the appearance of a universal king, a Chakravartin, and marched to the front of the company, where she claimed the honor of being the first to pay respects to the teacher upon his return to earth. The text tells us that she was the foremost in doing reverence to the Buddha. Equally aggrandizing but substantially shorter accounts of this event also appear in the Divyavadana and the Therigatha. The Therigatha provides a truncated version of the events described above, with the only few varying details, like, for instance, it mentions that while appearing as a universal king, she also miraculously manifests a chariot and an entourage. The Divyavadana version is the shortest of the three, making only a passing reference to the event as part of a longer story. Yet despite their variance in length and detail, all three of the texts give every indication that Upalavarna's actions were both noteworthy in their miraculous nature and commendable in their motivation. Specifically, her desire to be the first to see the Buddha. Additionally, the fact that sculptural representations of this scene appear in Gandhara by the 1st century BCE and at Mathura by the 1st century CE testifies to both the antiquity and the popularity of this story. You can see Upalavarna down below, kneeling at the feet, the staircase that represents the Buddha descending from heaven, flanked by the gods Brahma and Indra. It's interestingly, one of the few narrative events in which we have a nun depicted in the early artwork. So it's important for that as well. Okay. By the early 7th century, however, when the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang recorded the version of the story that he knew, it had changed and taken on a very different message. Most notably, Xuanzang's retelling of the event does not consider Utpalavarna's motivations or her actions to be at all praiseworthy. Rather, she is scolded by the Buddha for prioritizing his visual appearance over the invisible Dharma. Her actions are then contrasted with those of the monk Subhuti, who is said to have made the correct choice by deciding to stay at home and study the teachings, rather than to have greeted the Buddha in person. In other words, he was correct not to prioritize seeing the Buddha. The message here seems very much like the tale of Srima, in which visible forms are things to be overcome rather than desired. But the fact that it is the Buddha himself that is the source of her devotion certainly complicates that message. Serenity Young has observed that in some accounts of the Buddha's descent from heaven, this event is entirely excluded, as for example in the Buddha Charita. Or the monk Shariputra, rather than Upalavarna, is credited with having been the first to greet the Buddha upon his return, as if you read, you can read this in the Dhammapada commentary. While these omissions and alterations may not have been intended as direct critique of Upalavarna's miraculous actions, they do invite us to question why she is not mentioned. A shift in monastic attitudes towards women and increasing misogyny in Buddhist context is almost certainly played a part in Upalavarna's drop in status. But it's also likely that the late versions of the tale told by Xuanzang was intentionally critical of those earlier versions because they promoted devotion towards visual images of the Buddha. As was the case with the Vakali tale, it appears that some authors sought to curtail expressions of devotion that were based on sight and crafted alternatives to stories, like, for instance, those of Vakali and Utpalavarna, in which superhuman actions are undertaken to look upon the Buddha. Taken collectively, the stories of Srima, Nanda, Vakali, and Upalavarna reveal a few things about the role of vision in early Buddhism. They are consistent in teaching that vision is a dangerous source of desire, and that in almost every case, that impulse is something that needs to be overcome. They often present sight as a treacherous thing that constantly threatens us with new distractions and infatuations, keeping us from the pursuit of the Dharma. However, the situation is much more complicated when the object of attention is the Buddha himself. Some tales present Vakali and Upalavarna as heroes who gain insight through their dogged pursuit of apprehending the Buddha's visible form. They earn the titles foremost in implicit faith and foremost in doing reverence in recognition of their remarkable devotion, a devotion that was inspired by the sight of the Buddha or even just the promise of it. One might assume that looking at the Buddha would be universally considered the most praiseworthy of sights. Yet while some authors strongly agree that seeing his image is a necessary component for awakening. Others consider this form of devotion to be just another type of attachment. In the case of Vakali and Utpalavarna, whether or not it is a good thing to try and see the Buddha very much depends on who you ask. In short, the Buddhist relationship with vision is quite complex because there were disagreements within the community. This was assuredly exacerbated by the competing ways in which vision was understood in wider South Asian society. In many South Asian contexts, vision and sight were and still are synonyms for understanding. It's much like the use of the English "I see" as a way of saying "I understand." The term darshan, for example, typically refers to perception and apprehending through sight, but it can also refer to a philosophic position or a point of view. Therefore, sight can be understood as a kind of knowing or understanding. This is portrayed, for example, in the Divyavadana, where we encounter yet another monk who wishes to see the Buddha's physical body. But in this case, the motivations are a bit different. His interest in seeing the Buddha's physical form, or rupakaya, is described as an important complement or supplement to his understanding the Buddha's teachings, or dharma body, his dharmakaya. For the monk in the story, seeing or understanding both aspects of the Buddha's nature ultimately benefits his spiritual advancement. Being in the presence of a living Buddha is frequently described as one of the greatest possible karmic rewards. This is because seeing and hearing the Buddha preach provides an unparalleled opportunity for insight and awakening. For those not fortunate enough to live in the time of the Buddha, whole systems of internal visualization were created to replicate that experience. The Pali tradition introduced a meditative process known as Buddhanusati, in Sanskrit Buddhanusmriti. In this form of meditation, one recollects the Buddha, which is to say that one envisions the image of the Buddha in one's mind so as to benefit from being in the Buddha's presence as he preaches. In some cases, this practice has been linked to the use of images, but typically physical images are not required. In fact, the meditative process reveals some mistrust of images, and certainly of physical representations of the Buddha, and the attachments that they might engender. Sessions of Buddhanusmriti conclude with the practitioner reversing the process of embodiment and systematically dismissing or deconstructing the Buddha's form. This exercise may confirm the value in seeing the Buddha's form, but it also provides a firm reminder of his absence. Yet, no matter the way one might look upon the Buddha, the viewer's mindset when viewing him is often presented as the key to positive or negative outcomes. For example, Andy Rotman has written at length about the concept of prasada, and its role in the Avadana literature. He describes it as a state in which external stimuli, now in this case, it's typically seeing the Buddha's image, inspires acts of generosity and kindness. This compassionate mindset, which Rotman describes as a kind of arousal, automatically places one in the proper mental state for performing meritorious acts. In other words, what one sees affects one's attitudes and one's actions. This potentially opens the way to great karmic rewards, or it might just as easily inspire wicked deeds and the negative karma that they can produce. Vision then is a two-edged sword, and was therefore subject to a great deal of, well, and occasionally contradictory, regulation and commentary. Prasada, therefore, can be understood as an essentially positive way of harnessing the power of vision. Now, it also stands out as being one of the prevailing rationales that allowed for images to be effective without necessitating the Buddha's presence or attention in the image. In other words, the statue could be inert, the Buddha could remain entirely absent in nirvana, and the use of images could still bear results for the devout because the simple act of looking at it inspires or actively produces that good karma via the inspiration or that motivation provided by prasada. Although vision was occasionally presented as being conducive to attaining religious goals, it was more commonly understood as an impediment or a potential source of attachments. So as I've explained, the differences between negative and positive outcomes was largely contingent on the viewer's frame of mind. Therefore, defining how viewers should understand an image of the Buddha was of particular concern to Buddhist authors. But they generated very little consensus on what approach was the correct one. Buddhist views were very often at odds with one another. Some Buddhists strongly rejected the idea of the Buddha acting through an image. Others conditionally accepted it, and others were not troubled at all by those implications. In many cases, the critics saw the use of images as introducing potential risk, and a few even characterized it as dangerously misguided. So I hope hearing these tales and about these tales and visualization techniques has been engaging, but I also hope it has become clear how complicated the issue of sight can be. I strongly suspect, and I've argued this elsewhere, that many of these concerns and disagreements over the Buddha's image were made more pertinent and pressing because of the innovation and proliferation of physical artwork depicting the Buddha. Although the earliest examples, extant examples of Buddhist art can be dated to the 3rd century BCE or thereabouts, we don't see any images of the Buddha until the cusp of the 1st century CE. There is strong evidence for aniconism, which is the attentional avoidance of the Buddha's image. There are many examples in the early narrative relief sculptures in which an entire story is depicted, but the Buddha himself is omitted with only the empty spaces or symbols marking his intended presence. I can walk you through this particular example. It's one of my favorites. It's from the North Gate at Sanchi, and it's a depiction of the Great Departure. If you're unfamiliar with the tale, this is the moment when Prince Siddhartha Gautama decides to give up his life as a prince and enter the forest to become a renouncer. It's after, we're told it's at night after a big party, everyone's asleep, and the Buddha decides, or the future Buddha decides he's going to sneak out of the palace on horseback. The local gods, eager that the horse's footfalls and the sounds of on the pavement won't wake up the family, they lift the horse into the air and they carry it in some versions actually over the walls of the palace so that Shakyamuni can go out into the wilderness and begin his life as a renouncer. What we're looking at here is that Great Departure. You'll notice the red arrows point out the horse at various moments in its journey out into the wilderness. And I think you can see that there are groups of gods lifting it, where there's sort of this row of 3 figures around its legs. But in each case, we have an umbrella and a fly whisk. Those are the hallmarks of royalty in early India. Important people have umbrellas or parasols over their heads. And you can see that there's an umbrella and then there's a horse, but there's no one on it. That's where the future Buddhist should be. But here the artist has told the story, but quite intentionally left him out of the scene. In fact, even when Shakyamuni gets off the horse, if you look to the far right of the panel, you'll see the 2 footprints. Those are the Buddha's footprints in the dirt as he gets off the horse and stands on the ground. And so they very cleverly, the artist has shown the story, but very intentionally avoiding any depiction of the Buddha himself. Given the dramatic increase in sculpted images of the Buddha that characterized the material record of the 1st through 4th centuries in South Asia, it makes sense that Buddhist authors would address situations that involve seeing the Buddha. What is perhaps less expected is that the sources are not only concerned with the ways people view, they also address concerns over what the Buddha, or at least his statues, might themselves see. With this in mind, I'd like to start moving from the general ideas about vision in Buddhism towards my specific case study, focusing on the artistic changes made to the Buddha's eyes in 4th century South Asia. In the mid-1960s, Richard Gombrich documented Sri Lankan ceremonies performed to consecrate newly enshrined images of the Buddha. Such rituals culminated with rites intended to open the eyes of the Buddha. This entailed inviting a specialist to paint in the eyes of the statue, which was a cause for celebration in the local community. Gombrich's monastic informants, however, did not fully approve of these rituals. The monks understood the image as merely an inert reminder of the Buddha. Their attitude, the monastic attitude, might be characterized as one of resigned tolerance, seeing the ritual as misguided, but essentially harmless. Now, by contrast, the local artist and the broader lay community took the consecration ceremony very seriously. Skilled specialists, known as sitaru, were called in to paint the Buddha's eyes. They did so by using a mirror to avoid direct eye contact with the Buddha's gaze. The power of the image's vision was considered so intense that even after taking these precautions, the craftsman was blindfolded and then led from the temple, so he would first look upon a water pot or some other kind of prepared vessel so that it could be symbolically sacrificed, thus dissipating the residual power of eye contact with the Buddha. Such care and intensity certainly implies that the Buddha, or some measure of his identity, was resident within the completed statue. Gombrich characterizes the dichotomy between the knowledge of the Buddha's absence and the efficacious power of his image as a tension between cognitive and affective ways of thinking, both of which were embedded in Sri Lankan Buddhist worldview in the 1960s. So it might be tempting to characterize this dichotomy as one between the educated Sangha and the parochial laity, or more broadly, as traditional practices confronting newer modes of scientific rationalism informed by modernism and the colonial experience. Although such powerful cultural and political forces must have assuredly played a role in the participants' understanding of the past, of the event, tensions over the presence or absence of the Buddha are far, far older than the modern period. Whether ancient or modern, however, questions about vision, both devotees and the Buddhas, have remained central to the debate over his presence. There's never been a single Buddhist way to understand the Buddha's images. Multiple, often contradictory views of what it means to see an image of the Buddha have been present in Buddhism since the inception of the Buddhist tradition, of the image tradition. In fact, because of the ways depictions of the Buddha were intentionally avoided prior to the start of the first century, one must conclude that this topic was an issue even before the creation of the earliest Buddha images. Artists, donors, and members of the Sangha often justified avoiding his depiction in various ways. Does his depiction imply the Buddha's presence and accessibility? Might images undercut the finality of nirvana by suggesting access to the Buddha? And if not, how can an image be effective as a mode of religious practice? And this, for instance, is one of the reasons why the concept of prasada that we discussed earlier was so pertinent for early Buddhist writers. In these and other ways, the tension over the presence of the Buddha is in part connected to the importance of vision in Buddhism. This concern also manifests in textual sources as a desire to regulate how people understand their interactions with figural artwork. For better or worse, vision, more than any other sense, has the power to impact how we behave. A natural corollary of this is the recognition that some aspects of sight must be regulated. Going forward, I'd like to explain how the formalized Hindu ritual use of vision and eye contact, known as darshan, that became prevalent in the 4th century in North India, led to a change in the way that statues of the Buddha were made. This altered centuries of prior uniformity and consistency in the way the Buddha had been represented. And the change was contingent on the increased use of sculpture as a focus for Brahmanical, that is to say, early Hindu rituals that gained popularity in the 4th century and was eagerly embraced by the royalty of the Gupta dynasty. But before elaborating, however, I think it would be useful to unpack how vision was understood and regulated by the South Asian Buddhist community and by their monastic codes or Vinaya rules. I want to look at examples from prior to the 4th century to have a better understanding of how it is that the Buddhist community regulated vision, particularly monastic vision during those early centuries. So it's no exaggeration to state that almost every rule in the Buddhist codes of behavior, or the Vinayas, for the monastic community is predicated by a monk, nun, layperson, or god witnessing improper behavior and reporting it to the Buddha. Nothing escapes visual scrutiny. All manner of monastic behavior, ranging from terrible acts of violence to the style of a monk's undergarments or to the length of his nostril hairs are all regulated. In many cases, blameworthy actions are forbidden because they are inherently contrary to the Buddhist teachings. In other instances, however, as with the case of the underwear and nose hairs, rules appear to have been set in place exclusively to prevent misconceptions or disapproval. In these cases, one might easily assert that concerns over public perception, which is to say, visually witnessing the behavior, prompted rules rather than any inherent immoral quality in the act itself. This is particularly apparent in rules related to monks undertaking menial chores and physical labor. Gregory Chopin has noted how in the Mulla Sarvastivadin Vinaya requires monks to avoid being seen by the public when performing activities that might be associated with pollution, that is to say, with the activities undertaken by people of low social status. Manual labor, smithing, leatherworking, and cutting hair were all permissible and often necessary activities, but in each case, monks were only allowed to perform them in private, away from the gaze of the public. Being seen could generate negative public opinion, so such activities were to be done privately in order to preserve the community's positive image. In other words, some sites were permissible for the monastic community, but not suitable for the general public. Now, just as there were things the public should not see, there were also certain sites acceptable for the lay community that were forbidden to members of the Sangha. There's a rule, for example, that limits the subject matter to be used when adorning the monastery. This is to say, you couldn't put just anything on the walls of a monastery in order to decorate it. This rule is found in the Mulla Sarvastivadin Vinaya, as well as in the Chinese version of the Sarvastivadin Vinaya. As is standard for these Vinaya texts, the restrictions are predicated by a story that explains and justifies it. In both versions, a monk, by the way, this is our old friend, the Buddha's half-brother Nanda, is feeling wistful and begins to draw an image of a woman whom he had been betrothed before joining the monastery. He's sketching this on a rock. At this inopportune moment, a senior monk sees the image and scolds the amateur artist, ultimately bringing the matter before the Buddha. This leads to the pronouncement of a rule, forbidding monks from creating images of living beings. Now, this passage seems primarily intended to counter the more titillating aspects of visual arts, and that may be contrary to the life of a celibate monastic. However, there's also good reason to believe that it was intended to prevent public disapproval or misunderstanding. For example, the Sarvastivada Vinaya contains rules explicitly preventing the decoration of stupas with images of men and women coupling. In the Chulavagga of the Pali Vinaya Pitaka, similar concerns are also expressed. It contains a general restriction on the representation of men or women used as decoration in monastic dwellings. In both cases, there are good reasons to think that public perception played a role in the formalization of the rule. The Pali Vinaya makes this apparent by framing the rule with a story about guests in the monastery who are shocked to see depictions of people on the walls of a monk's cell and begin to question the legitimacy of the entire Buddhist monastic order. Presented in this fashion, the Buddha's restrictions would seem to have as much to do with external perceptions as with internal discipline. Either way, these rules identify visual imagery that was suitable to the laity, but deemed to be inappropriate for members of the monastic community, and the structures in which they lived and in which they worshipped. This is certainly not the only rule in the Vinayas requiring members of the monastic community to control their gaze. As is very well known, monks were always expected to conduct themselves with proper decorum, especially when traveling outside the monastery. At these times, they were required to direct their eyes downward. The self-control required to regulate their vision was seen as conducive to both monastic practice and positive public perception. In short, appearances mattered. What members of the monastic community saw and what they allowed others to see them doing were both of deep concern to the writers of the monastic codes. It's also clear that a great deal of this concern goes beyond the moral implications of actions and aims to forestall any criticism voiced by witnesses. What an individual sees can impact what they think. Vision, therefore, holds great potential for misunderstanding, which is a risk both for the individual and for the monastic institution as a whole. So, as I mentioned earlier, the development of the Buddhist image at the start of the 1st century CE drastically changed the visual landscape for Buddhists and introduced new categories of visual imagery and new problems for Buddhist authors. One of the most impactful challenges faced by the Buddhist community involved the common and widespread South Asian understanding of images as more than just passive objects. Images of Vedic gods, religious teachers, and living kings were almost never depicted before the 1st century. What were common, however, were impressive images of regional terrestrial gods and spirits like yakshas or yakshis, or the snake-like nagas or nagis. These were terrestrial deities of health and wealth and abundance who were venerated through their images. Not only do we have descriptions and depictions of the food and flowers and offerings that were brought to these beings, as we also have depictions of their tree shrines known as chaityas. There are also narrative tales in which these images move or react or carry out the wills of the deity that they depict. This sort of embodiment was inherent in cultural ideas about images. While this was not a problem for terrestrial deities or spirits, it posed a challenge for many schools of Buddhism. In particular, it was a challenge for those traditions which emphasized the goal of nirvana, a permanent, transcendent escape from the cycle of rebirth, and a state totally detached from the world of samsara, from our world. In case you're wondering about the images, the one I'm showing you here is from Amravati in South India, and it depicts a moment when the Buddha's mother is presenting the child who will become the Buddha to the family yaksha, the spirit of the local family. And so she goes to his chaitya, his tree shrine. You can see the tree depicted behind the figure and the bench that would have been the altar. And she's about to lay the child on the altar as an offering to get the blessings of the spirit. But because this child is so special, the spirit manifests. You can see Shakyavardhana emerging from the altar, and he has his hands up in prayer. He's going to pray to the child of the Buddha. Because this image predates the use of images of the Buddha, the cloth that Queen Maya is holding has 2 little footprints in it, and that represents where the child would be, even though he's not visually depicted in the sculpture. So, for this reason, debates over the Buddha's image often split along sectarian lines. Images were naturally less of an issue in Mahayana schools of Buddhism, in which Buddhahood rather than nirvana was seen as the goal. And this is particularly the case in those later schools in which the Buddhas are understood to still be active in the world rather than totally apart from it in nirvana. However, this remained a very big problem to the mainstream schools of early Buddhism, including those of the Nikaya tradition. Images implied presence, and the figure that was images implied the presence of the figure that was depicted, or at least suggested the possibility of access to him. For early Buddhists, these implications ran contrary to the finality of nirvana. Concern over this conceptual issue were most likely a driving force behind some of the strongest Buddhist resistance to honoring the Buddha's visual form. Despite these objections, the material record shows us that the image tradition ultimately prevailed, growing more and more popular with time. Those who objected continued to exist, but over time, the vast majority of Buddhists found ways to rationalize or justify the use of images. To summarize here, in case it's not clear, images in early South Asia implied the presence of the individual that was being depicted. We know that images of local gods were intervened with as if they were standing in for the god themselves. We know that there were rituals that were used in which effigies of an intended target could be made, and then religious rites could be performed in order to affect that person through the image. And so there was a direct correspondence between the two. When the Buddha's image first appears, the early Buddhists, many of them seem, at least those who disapproved of the use of images, were concerned that the presence of the image might also imply the Buddha's presence and undercut that finality of nirvana. So let's turn. Yet, as we've discussed, images, including those of Shakyamuni Buddha, were credited with a substantial degree of agency in early South Asia. This is seen most clearly in the ways the Buddhist legal codes grappled with how to manage the presence of images in monasteries. In some documented cases, images of the Buddha were treated as independent entities, and they had several legal rights of their own, including the ability to receive gifts and to own property. This agency ascribed to images meant that not only was there great concern over how devotees understood Shakyamuni's images and what the images might imply about impermanence, there was also concern over what, if anything, the statues themselves might see. To better understand this issue, it's essential not to study Buddhism in isolation. They were not the only South Asian religious communities grappling with increased presence of figural imagery in religious contexts. In fact, some of the most vociferous debates over the role of images and what are certainly the most profound changes in the use of images as part of religious ritual can be seen among the Hindu Brahmanical traditions, rather than among the Buddhists. In the early years of the Common Era, the Brahmin community struggled with this topic. Many Brahmins were hostile to those who attempted to depict the Vedic gods in physical form. And these arguments often parallel those we find in Buddhist sources. The Purva-Mimamsa school, for example, was strongly averse to the use of any image in ritual practice. They rejected the possibility of divine embodiment in any form and argued that all textual references to God's bodies were entirely metaphorical. A less extreme position was held by the Vedanta thinkers. In this philosophical school, particularly in the Advaita Vedanta branch, they took a more moderate approach and allowed for the possibility that gods might embody themselves if they desired to do so. These positions find almost exact parallels among various Buddhist views, as do these, what I'm going to relate now, the more extreme views. For example, some early Brahmanical sources held exceptionally negative views of those who used images in worship. This is exemplified in the Manusmriti, or the Laws of Manu, a Brahmanical legal text often attributed to the 2nd century CE, which marginalizes and demeans a group known as Devalakas. These are temple priests who attend images. They, along with doctors and butchers, are to be excluded from funerary rituals and from all rites directed to the Vedic gods or ancestors. This disdain for people who would normally hold high status, which is to say Brahmins, is explicitly connected to their central role in devotional acts involving sculptural representations of the gods. However, the very need for this rule and the need for it to exist tells us that enough Brahmins were apparently participating in image-based forms of devotion to warrant commentary by concerned traditionalists. Over time, those Brahmins who looked favorably on image use began to gain support, just as like-minded groups did among the Buddhists. By the 4th century, Brahmin priests' prevailing attitudes towards images had begun to change. The Gupta period saw the rise of royally supported temple-based Hinduism and the increased prominence of both bhakti, which is to say emotionally charged forms of worship, and darshan, eye contact with the divine, typically mediated through an image. Bhakti is a devotional and accessible form of Hindu devotion that emphasizes an emotional and personal contact with the divine. Darshan is one aspect of this loving devotion, and in a ritual context, it refers to the eye contact made between the deity and the devotee that is typically mediated through the form of the image. This form of sight is a kind of direct contact with the divine, and it is often the primary goal for devotees who attend a Hindu puja or public festival. It is this ritual framework in which eyes are the most immediate and direct way to access the divine that has come to define for many the dominant forms of Hindu religious devotion. Although these changes in Hindu ritual did not occur all at once, by the 4th century they were becoming more and more central. This shift in religious practice posed challenges to both Vedic or Brahmanical traditionalists and to the Buddhists. It solidified ideas about images and created expectations of an immediate personal encounter with the object of devotion, mediated through the image. As is probably apparent, this approach was directly contrary to long-standing Buddhist views on images that insisted on the Buddha's absence and the fundamental nature of impermanence. A Buddhist response to this increasingly dominant Hindu mindset can be seen in Buddha images created in the Gupta territories. This change starts in the early years of the 4th century and is first apparent in North Indians centered on the Mathura region. Let's look at the earliest examples of Buddha images first so that we can track how they've changed over time. So the earliest images of the Buddha were created primarily in 2 regions in South Asia. Mathura, which is in north-central India, and Gandhara, which is now mostly in what's Pakistan. Although the images of Shakyamuni from both regions share similar iconography, they are stylistically quite distinct. This is to say that the manner in which they represent the Buddha was influenced by local sculptural traditions, with Gandhara influenced by the Greek Bactrian world, and Mathura having drawn Yaksha images from Yaksha images created regionally. But both styles use the exact same iconography to portray the Shakyamuni Buddha. This includes the cranial bump or ushnisha, the mark or whorl of hair on the forehead, the urna, and the distended earlobes, simple monastic robes, halo, or nimbus. For our current discussion, and the most important of these differences is the way in which the artists in these 2 regions represented Shakyamuni's eyes. Gandharan Buddhas typically exhibit partially closed eyes with heavy lids. Now, by contrast, the standard Mathura types have large, wide-open eyes, which were derived from the eyes depicted on statues of yakshas and other terrestrial deities. The Mathuran artists drew on familiar large-scale forms when sculpting the earliest Buddhas, so the similarities with the images of yakshas are most likely a byproduct of their production and a reflection of local style. In comparing this yaksha from Vidisha, located near Mathura, with a 2nd century image of Shakyamuni that was produced in Mathura and installed in a monastery in Sarnath, we can note the large staring eyes, frontal stance, resting equally on both of the feet, the broad shoulders, balled fist up at the hip, grasping in one case a flask and the other the outer monastic robe. These so-called Kapardan-style figures from Mathura, of which the Shakyamuni image is a late example, are arguably the earliest images, circa 1st century CE, that are appear in Mathura and are invariably sculpted with prominent, wide-open eyes, clearly defined upper and lower eyelids. As a side note, I've been intentionally referring to these images as Shakyamuni rather than as the Buddha, because when they do have inscriptions, the Mathuran examples are identified as bodhisattvas. Ju Hyung-ri has argued convincingly that they are intended to represent Shakyamuni before his enlightenment, and thus prior to attaining Buddhahood. Now, by contrast, by contrast, the earliest inscribed Gandharan Shakyamuni images are typically identified as Buddhas, despite being iconographically identical to the Mathuran bodhisattvas. This regional difference is made particularly apparent in one inscription bearing, one image bearing an inscription that identifies it both as a Buddha and as a bodhisattva, each in a different language. Both B.N. Mukherjee and Gregory Chopin have discussed this biscriptural inscription from a base of a Mathuran sculpture. The Brahmi language portion, which is typical for Mathura, identifies the figure as a bodhisattva, whereas the Kharoshthi portion, the language that was used primarily in Gandhara, describes it as a Buddha. The implication then is that 2 Buddhists might see the same image and understand it in 2 different ways. There is substantial evidence for contact and exchange between the 2 regions of Mathura and Gandhara, however, and these differences in nomenclature appear to have eroded over time and with the designation of Buddha becoming applied more universally. This contact occurred most intensely over the long periods of time when both regions were part of the same empires, most notably during the Shaka and Kushan control. This is roughly mid-2nd century BCE to about the 4th century. An interesting and very early example of this artistic exchange was noted by Johanna van Luijsen de Leeuw. She identified the Mathuran influence on some Gandharan images of Shakyamuni, with only one shoulder covered. This was more typical of the Matharan images, to have one shoulder covered, whereas in Gandhara, both of the shoulders are covered. And widely staring eyes. So she would argue that this is a Gandharan image that shows emphasis, or I should say influence, from Mathura because of the wide open eyes and the single shoulder covered. Conversely, Ji Hungri notes robes covering both shoulders associated with Gandharan images that appear sometime on some Matharan images of the late 2nd century. So here again, the reverse, we see the a robe covering both shoulders. So in other words, contact existed and persisted over the centuries. And this is most strongly confirmed by the identical iconography used in both regions. It's exceptionally unlikely that this shared iconography would have developed without contact, especially because the artistic representation differs in significant ways from the textual descriptions. Now, I want to note here one thing, which is that all of the Matharan images, even those with the Gandharan style robes, were consistent in retaining their wide open eyes, as you can see in the examples here. By the 4th century, however, the heavy lids become increasingly common, eventually giving way to a new type of Buddha image whose eyes are half closed in a manner akin to what we see in Gandhara. Some of the clearest examples of this transition can be seen in Sarnath. Compare the eyes of the early 5th century Buddha head with those of an earlier one, and the differences become immediately apparent. The prominent staring eyes are occluded behind drooping eyelids. It does not seem that the artist intended to close the Buddha's eyes entirely, but the eyelid disrupts normal eye contact and indicates that the gaze is directed downward, even in the absence of a clearly indicated pupil. Although these two well-known examples make a strong contrast, there is some variation and experimentation apparent in the ways the eyes were rendered during the early 4th century. In all cases, however, the eyelids are lowered enough to impede the image's forward gaze, marking it a pervasive and noteworthy change from earlier practices. As noted previously, the shift to Buddhas with downcast eyes is most apparent in the territories held by the Gupta Empire. While it's plausible to assume that this change was inspired by Gandharan-style Buddhas, one must ask why, at this point, after centuries of consistency and contact, did the Matharan artists decide to alter the way in which the Buddha's eyes were represented. As noted earlier, the two regions had been in contact long before the Gupta period. Prior artists must have been aware of the differences, and yet chose not to adopt them. This brings us back to the changes in Hindu ritual that I discussed earlier. Notably, it is only the Buddha who is singled out with this change in appearance. Gupta images of gods and bodhisattvas continue to exhibit the wide-open eyes that had been characteristic of Matharan-style images for centuries. The consistency of the images of other religious figures suggests that the change relates to something unique about the nature of the Buddha. How do we explain this? The reasons for the development appear to have stemmed from both concerns arising within Buddhism and from forces impacting it from the outside. I believe this innovation, after roughly 4 centuries of iconographic consistency, was a response to the emergence of temple-based Hinduism and the codification of ritual practices centered on darshan and bhakti that developed during the same period. These modes of Hindu worship emphasize the inherent links between images and the divine, particularly in ritual contexts. Most typically, as expressed primarily in the Vedanta literature, the deity in Hindu ceremonies was not seen as being identical to the image, but was understood to become present through the image during the course of the ceremony. The immediacy and accessibility provided by such practices had great appeal. This popularity must have presented a significant challenge to Buddhist modes of image use and their general insistence on the total and permanent absence of the teacher. At a minimum, the rise of temple-based devotion must have resurfaced old concerns held by those elements of the Buddhist community who disapproved of image use and feared that it might lead to misunderstanding. Although temple-based devotion involving acts of offering and veneration had already been around for a very long time, these challenges appear to have become particularly potent with the Gupta royal support of primarily Vaishnava temple construction and of the Brahmin priests who oversaw these rites. As criticism of these image-centered rituals declined among the Brahmin community, the monastic traditions were alone in stemming the tide of public perception. This period seems to mark an important transition to systematized temple-based practices overseen directly and exclusively by the Brahmin priesthood. Newly built, royally sponsored religious architecture, as exemplified here by the 4th or 5th century site like Deogar, or as I'll show you in a moment, Udaigiri, formalized and sanctioned temple-based modes of Brahmanical religious practice. Specifically, these rock-cut and freestanding structures enshrined images into which the Brahmin priests invited the deity to be present through the ritual, or known as the puja. These rites were the culmination of a complex process by which the access of old Vedic rituals, which used burnt offerings to send the prayers up to the gods in heavens, were inverted, and instead the deity was now made present on earth through the intermediary of the image. At the Gupta Corpse Religious Center at Udaigiri, the deity's eyes are prominently on view, both inside and outside the rock-cut shrines. Although the erosion is significant enough to have effaced the eyes of some of the images, all the extant examples are wide-eyed. This is true of the deities preserved outside Cave 6, like the massive Raha, who's seen here in profile, and the Ekamukha Linga, or the one-faced Linga, seen inside Cave 4, which is seen on the right. These prominent eyes were not only a continuation of earlier artistic styles, they also played a primary role in Hindu acts of devotion. Central to these Hindu forms of worship was the ritualized connection between the worshiper and the divine, mediated through the eyes of an image or a cult icon, which serves as a focus for devotion. As I've noted, darshan is an important component in devotional worship, wherein the devotee makes eye contact with the divine by gazing upon the eyes of a ritually prepared image. To support these practices, the representation and creation of a deity's eyes became an important and highly regulated aspect of Hindu image production. Now, for example, the Chitra Sutra of the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, which was written in the 6th through 8th century, this text is a manual instructing artists and priests how to properly create and prepare images of the gods. It represents the views of a fully matured Brahmanical image-based system of devotion. Giving increased centrality to darshan over the centuries, it is not surprising that the text stipulates the eyes of a god must always be prominent and level. By contrast, in its description of a poorly made image, the text states that in the cases of images to be worshipped, a downward or oblique gaze should be avoided because such images incur grief and misfortune. Yet, as we've seen, this is precisely what the Buddhists do. In the 4th century, just as darshan is becoming institutionalized in royally supported temples, the Buddhists of Mathura, Sarnath, and other parts of North India introduce images of the Buddha with half-closed eyes that eventually replace the earlier style entirely. Specifically, this new manner of representing the Buddha's eyes effectively prevented eye contact with the viewer and broke any potential implications of a connection. In so doing, it also broke with the standard visual forms that had remained consistent in the region over prior centuries. Because of their introspective demeanor, appearing to focus on a point a few inches beyond the nose, it might be tempting to assume that this new style of Buddha represents him engaging in meditation. This interpretation is unlikely, however, because it's complicated by the frequent presence of downward-looking Buddhas in narrative contexts in which the Buddha is explicitly not meditating. Many 4th century examples represent the Buddha in the midst of preaching, making the gift-giving, the Varada Mudra gesture, and other activities which are not typically meditative acts, and which involve direct interaction with others. Also, the textual description of these narratives make no mention of the Buddha being in a meditative state. Both the specificity of this change, limited almost exclusively to Buddhas, and the narrative context that preclude meditation, they help us to rule out other motivations that might underlie this innovation. In short, the move towards a Buddha with an oblique gaze appears to be a firm denial of darshan and an affirmation of the Buddha's absence. the lowered gaze of the Buddha intentionally disrupts eye contact, and by extension, any assumptions of contact with the Buddha himself. This simple alteration denies the presence of the Buddha in his image by preventing the 4th century's primary manner of engaging with images. Although we know that images of the Buddha were often believed to have agency and potency, there seems to have been a limit to this acceptance. Unlike their Hindu counterparts, these images explicitly do not mediate between the devotee and the divine subject. With a subtle iconographic shift, the Buddhists were visibly denying the Buddha's treatment as a god. That this alteration is most apparent in the same regions that house the earliest Hindu temples seems more than a coincidence. As grand Brahmin-controlled temples became increasingly powerful, they redefined image-based devotion in the region. These developments are physically embodied in the Dasavatara temple at Deogar, a Gupta temple constructed to facilitate devotional rituals, that is to say pujas, and darshan. It dates to the late 5th or early 6th century, and this freestanding Vaishnava temple is adorned with spectacular relief sculpture. The eyes of the figures can be difficult to read because they all bulge slightly forward, and in the absence of incised or painted pupils, they might be easily misread as being closed. Given the well-known narrative context of the reliefs, however, we must conclude that the eyes are indeed all open. Surprisingly, this includes the reclining Vishnu image, resting on the back of the great serpent, or Naga Shesha, which is depicted on the south side of the temple. The deity's eyes are in fact more clearly open than any of the surrounding figures. Yet in the narrative being depicted, the god Vishnu sleeps on the back of the cosmic serpent Sesha. And as he dreams, a lotus emerges from his navel, the lotus blossoms, revealing the creator deity Brahma, who emerges and begins the process of creating the world. Vishnu's sleep is a key element to this creation story, and yet here, his eyes are wide open. This makes a striking contrast to the Buddha's images, who invariably look down even when it does not fit with the narrative context. Here it would seem that darshan of the deity was to be facilitated at all costs, even if it meant depicting a sleeping god with open eyes. The newly dominant devotional practices centered on darshan must have posed a challenge to traditional Buddhist forms of image use, and this challenge required a response. In rebuttal, the eyes of the Buddha changed. He no longer engaged the viewer directly with his forward stare. These changes in iconography interfered with darshan, refuted any notion of the Buddha's divinity, and affirmed his complete absence in nirvana. According to most South Asian Buddhist traditions, nirvana was a permanent state, totally apart from the world. The prevalent ritual logic of darshan threatened to undermine this finality. If catching the Buddha's eye through his image might be mistaken for a moment of contact or darshan, then this experience itself had to be subverted. The subtle but innovative alteration in the Buddha's eyes changed centuries of artistic tradition, but in so doing, decisively prevented any implications that one might receive darshan of the Buddha. Now, the Buddha's image had to navigate between doctrinal requirements and societal expectations. It is clear, however, that not every Buddhist agreed how best to do this. As might be expected, there are indications that not all Buddhists were troubled by the Buddha being compared to a divinity. This same period at the end of the 3rd and the start of the 4th century saw the emergence of theories postulating the absolute immortality of the Buddha, in which he was characterized as an eternal being possessed of a body of adamant or vajrakaya. Therefore, the legacy of these stylistic changes is uneven, and they persisted in there we go. Okay, and they persisted in Sarnath and spread to other regions, including Southeast Asia. But by the late 5th century, caves of Ajanta are less consistent in their use of half-closed eyes. These changes may be due to the rising prominence of Mahayana schools who are more comfortable with ideas of the Buddha, meaning of Buddha's remaining active in the world. But it might also be the byproduct of artistic style. Shrines to the Buddha are included at the backs of the viharas, starting in the late 5th century, suggesting an increased interest in presence and proximity. Yet the painted images at Ajanta demonstrate that even bodhisattvas and humans could have languid, heavy lids, and that clearly rendered pupils in these paintings reveal that many of the figures avoided eye contact by simply looking obliquely away from the viewer. The Buddha, both sculpted and painted, have lowered eyes, but some disrupt eye contact more than others. One might argue that the need for rigorous attention to these details had relaxed in the intervening decades. Nevertheless, it is clear that the wide-eyed figures of earlier centuries were gone forever and remained permanently out of fashion. Just as early authors found ways to justify and defend devotional practices, even in the Buddha's absence, downturned eyes did not preclude all forms of devotional worship. Image use continued to be a powerful form of Buddhist religious practice, just as it had in earlier centuries. The 7th century Chinese pilgrim I Ching, for example, reported on the mandatory daily illustrations and offerings made to Buddha images at the great monastery at Nalanda, and described the criticism faced by those who did not wish to participate. As made apparent by the account of the Sri Lankan eye-opening ceremony that I told just a moment ago, aspects of these same tensions were still at play in the 1960s and are still playing out today. From the Buddhist perspective, vision presents a number of potential pitfalls that vary significantly depending on who is doing the looking and how they interpret what they see. Perception is a nebulous thing, however. Cultural shifts and changes in public expectations can quickly change the meaning of old and familiar sights. When confronted with growing public expectations of darshan in the 4th century in North India, the Buddha's open eyes risked taking on unwanted implications and the expectations that he should be treated as a god. Changes from outside Buddhism threatened the justifications that allowed for the use of images without compromising ideology. Therefore, the images had to change to address this concern. Vision in Buddhist tradition is more than a simple sensory experience. It can have profound karmic repercussions. What one should or should not see varies among the laity and members of the monastic community. In all cases, however, the way sights are interpreted and the actions they inspire are far more significant than the subject matter itself. While it might be apparent that monks generally should avoid looking at sexual imagery, even seeing images of the Buddha was apparently not without risk. Drawing the wrong conclusions could lead devotees to engage in misguided practices that were fruitless at best and karmically damaging at worst. To protect against this, attention had to be paid to where the Buddha was looking, and sometimes it was the easiest solution was for the Buddha to simply look away. Thank you.
No, we thank you and thank our audience for attending today.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been an honor.